For this segment, I want to give an overview of the Constitution. As you know, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and any policies concerning economics or anything else should fall within the limits of our Constitution. Now, almost everybody will say that we believe in the Constitution and we want our government to uphold the Constitution, but what I've found is very few people really understand what the Constitution says and means. Now, it's much easier to understand what the Constitution means if you understand what the Founding Fathers were trying to do when they developed the Constitution. The Founders talked about two extremes of government. On the one hand, they had tyranny, which they thought the king was. They thought he was a tyrant, he was going too far on that side. Well, what's the other extreme of government? The other extreme they thought was anarchy. But after they threw off the king, they had the Articles of Confederation, which were very weak, and they thought that that really tended towards anarchy. So what the founders were trying to do was find that happy medium in the middle, giving government enough power that the government could do what it was meant to do, but not too much power that it became tyrannical. Now, the Articles of Confederation were inadequate in many ways. There was no executive, no judiciary, no taxing power, and anything that was passed had to be passed by at least 9 states, and sometimes it had to be unanimous. Of course, they met in Philadelphia. The original intent was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they understood quickly that they needed to just start over from scratch. The founders had many different ideas of how they were trying to get to where they were going, even though they were kind of all heading in the same direction. There were various divisions between the North and the South, the big states, small states, all those things like that. So what ended up really in Philadelphia was a lot of compromise. When the delegates left after they signed the document, most of them went away unhappy, feeling, well, they didn't really get what they wanted. It wasn't until later when they all started debating the Constitution and figuring out what it really said that they really saw the genius of the Constitution because of all those compromises. Even though the founders had many ideas of how they get there, they almost all agreed on one thing, that a Republican form of government was the best form. Well, how did they get to believe that? Well, again, they looked at Scripture, and if you look at Exodus 21, it says, "But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens." This really describes a Republican form of government. Noah Webster, the author of Webster's Dictionary, said this: "Our citizens should early understand that genuine source of correct Republican principles is the Bible." Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration, considered by his peers to be the third most prominent founding father, said this. He said, "I've always considered Christianity as the strong ground of republicanism." In essence, the founders embodied that natural law we talked about into the Constitution. Again, I'll quote James Wilson, who was a signer of the Constitution, an original Supreme Court justice. He said, "Human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters, friends and mutual assistants. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other." Benjamin Rush said about the Constitution, he said, "I do not believe that the Constitution was the offspring of inspiration, but I am as perfectly satisfied that the Union of the States in its form and adoption is as much the work of a divine providence as any of the miracles recorded in the Old and New Testament." James Madison in Federalist 37 said, "The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on these circumstances without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in a finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the revolution. So again, after the fact, the founders really thought that God had a big hand, or actually the hand, in the creation of our Constitution. So what are some of the basic themes of the Constitution? Both Washington and Adams said that Jeremiah 17:9 was the critical verse when it comes to the design of the Constitution. What does Jeremiah 17:9 say? It says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it?" What? What's that got to do with government? Well, a lot if you understand the concept, because the founding fathers understood the sin nature of man, the fallenness of man. And they understood, like Lord John Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what they wanted to do was set up a system of checks and balances so that no one person or no one entity could have too much power. James Madison articulated this principle of the fallenness of man in Federalist 51. He said, "It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices, meaning checks and balances of power, should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary." If you contrast that with a humanist view during the French Revolution, where there was no checks and balances on power, what did it lead to? The reign of terror. So what our founders tried to do is checks and balances and also limited government. We call the Constitution one of enumerated powers, meaning that any power that is not specifically listed as a power of the national government is not a power of the national government and is reserved to the states. Again, Madison said in Federalist 45, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." This concept was further affirmed in the 10th Amendment, which says that the federal government has only those enumerated powers and all other powers belong to the states or to the people. But think about what's going on today. Is our federal government limited in power? No. They've gone well beyond what was the design of the Constitution, and we'll get into that later. How did they put into the Constitution those checks and balances? Well, we see that very clearly with the three branches of government. You have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. And each one of those is supposed to check and balance the other. Sometimes those spheres overlap a little bit, but again, the design is that they should be somewhat separate and balance the others out. Now, the big question is, were all three of the branches designed to be co-equal? You hear that a lot today in political talk, the three equal branches. Well, again, according to our founders, that was not the design. Which branch should, by design, be the most powerful branch? Well, it's the legislature. Again, Madison said, "In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates." So which branch should be the weakest branch? Should be the judicial branch. Again, in Federalist 78, Hamilton said, "The judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. The general liberty of the people can never be endangered by that quarter." Of course, it seems that Hamilton was wrong because we have been endangered by that quarter. But if we were abiding by what our Constitution really says, the judiciary would not pose a problem and they would indeed be the weakest branch. When people think about separation of powers, they always think about the three branches of government. However, there's another separation of powers that most people don't think about, and that's the separation of powers between the national, the state, and the local governments. And that's very important as well. Jefferson said, "I believe the states can best govern our home concerns, and the general, meaning the federal government, our foreign ones." What each of those branches of government are supposed to do is, again, a check and balance on the other. If the federal government oversteps its authority, the state governments should push back on them and not allow it. Same with the local governments to the state or federal entities. Government power should be decentralized. The most powerful government should be not the federal government, but the local governments. And in fact, Alexis de Tocqueville in his Democracy in America said that every village formed a sort of republic, which is accustomed to conducting its own affairs. He didn't see why anybody would want to run for national office since all the power was at the local level. Again, we flip that on its head today. Hamilton, again in the Federalist, said, "This balance between the national and state governments ought to be dwelt on with particular attention, as it is of the utmost importance. It forms a double security to the people. If one encroaches on their rights, they will find a powerful protection in the other. Indeed, they will both be prevented from overpassing the constitutional limits by certain rivalship which will ever subsist between them." Another basic principle in the Constitution is the rule of law, as talked about by Samuel Rutherford in his classic Lex Rex, which means law is king. John Locke said, "Freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society and made by the legislature power erected in it." John Adams said, "No man will contend that a nation can be free that is not governed by fixed laws. All other government than that of permanent known laws is the government of mere will and pleasure." Needless to say, if we look at our government today, we don't abide by the rule of law very well when we have presidents or governors who essentially make law of their own. It's their whim, the whims of the courts, etc. Again, we need to get back to the general principles of our Constitution. Where's the separation of powers we have today? Again, the federal government rules all. There's no separation of powers. Where's the rule of law? It's not there anymore. Where's the reliance on the laws of nature and nature's God? Well, God, in essence, has been thrown out of the public square. We can't even talk about what God says in the Bible anymore in our public discourse. Again, it's up to we, the people, to get back to these basic principles of the Constitution.